Meanwhile, the West continues to support Ukraine in every possible way. It has just got an IMF loan, a loan worth $15.6 billion, and it's unprecedented. The IMF has never lent money to a country at war. But it made an exception for Ukraine. The IMF, of course, is the International Monetary Fund. It has been around for 77 years. Many countries have gone to war in these years. Many have suffered serious crises. But a wartime loan, and that too worth $15.6 billion, was granted only to Ukraine. The question is why? There is no doubt that the Ukrainians could use this money. Their country is battered by war. They need funds. But so are many others in dire need. And the IMF is supposed to assess risk before lending money. Look at what they did with Sri Lanka. It needed a much smaller loan, just $3 billion. The IMF made them jump a number of hoops and took a full year before agreeing to grant the money. How is Ukraine's crisis more urgent? Because Ukraine has Western backers and white citizens. There's no other way to put it. And the IMF is not exactly a fair institution. The International Monetary Fund was set up in the year 1945 after the Second World War. It was set up and controlled by countries that won the war, chiefly the United States. The IMF does not give its members equal voting rights. These rights are given in the form of quotas, and the quotas are based on a country's contribution to the IMF. So obviously rich countries which donate more money pull the strings. These are countries like the United States, Japan, China, and Germany. And the US has by far the largest voting share. It's about 16.5%. The second is Japan at 6.14%, followed by China, 6.08%, and so on. Now, you could say this sounds fair. Those who fund the IMF should get a bigger say on how these funds are used. But there's more to it. Donations are not the only things that affect voting shares. There's also a baked-in bias. You need a supermajority of 85% of the votes to change vote shares. How do you see the game? The US controls 16.5% of the IMF votes. It effectively holds the veto power over changing representation. And Washington can bully the institution into doing its bidding. Which brings us back to the case of Ukraine. You see, till last Friday, Ukraine was not eligible for a loan from the International Monetary Fund. That's because it was at war, and war obviously poses a massive risk for any lender, including the IMF. So Ukraine was ineligible. But then a rule was changed. This was for countries facing, quote-unquote, exceptionally high uncertainty. Such countries could get an IMF loan according to the new rule. And the IMF did not explicitly state that this change was for the benefit of Ukraine, but it did not have to. It was obvious. A few weeks ago, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was in Kiev. It was a surprise visit, like most visits to Ukraine now. She announced another $1.2 billion in economic aid to Ukraine. She also talked up Ukraine's responsible use of funds.
We welcome President Zelensky's ardent commitment to handling these funds in the most responsible way. Our delivery partners at the World Bank have instituted robust safeguards for transparency and accountability. And the US government has deployed independent third-party monitors to bolster oversight.
Washington has directly given Ukraine over $14 billion in economic aid. This is over and above the billions in military aid. The total crossed $50 billion some time back. And it might start pinching the US to keep funding Ukraine. So what do? They rope in one of their lackey institutions. The rules are changed and more money is pumped into Ukraine. It just shows how America can back allies despite risks and how it can overwrite all rule books. People starving in broken economies do not matter. Those waiting for days in line to buy fuel and food do not matter. Those that the US invades will never get a bailout, even during a war where millions are being killed, or even in the aftermath when the US leaves crippling instability in its wake. But Washington's friends in Europe can always count on Uncle Sam finding the funds.